Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're here to answer one simple question. Why on earth does this CPU still cost $75 to buy? Now what you see here is essentially a Pentium D, but it is the most powerful hyper-threading enabled Extreme Edition. Intel seemed to have dropped the D from the name, perhaps because the Pentium D wasn't all that great, but that's essentially what we have here. More specifically, it's the Pentium Extreme Edition 965 and it's a dual core clocked at 3.73 GHz. At the time of its release in 2006, it would have set the buyer back close to $1,000. Now normal Pentium D processors can be purchased for way under $10 and the same goes for pounds, but if you want to get your hands on one of these, then be prepared to pay a premium. Maybe it costs so much because it can be overclocked out of the box on air to about 4.2 GHz thanks to its unlocked multiplier, or maybe it's because even when idle the power consumption hovers around 130 watts and the warmth coming from it is enough to double as your heating system. Whatever the reason, we're going to be putting it to the test. So here's our chip, complete with 10 years worth of thermal paste, the sign of a well-used workhorse. A lot of the time, people wouldn't keep using older CPUs like this as they start to transition into that sort of classic status, but we've been told ours has been on every day for about 5 years up until we purchased it. So this thing gets pretty hot, as I've hinted, and uses around 205 watts under load. So we're going to be using an aftermarket cooler. This one should do it. We'll also be overclocking it to 4.2 GHz to push it to the limit, and seeing as this can be done pretty easily, it would be a shame not to. The rest of our setup includes 8GB of DDR3 RAM and the RX 460 from AMD. A nice budget card that will in no way bottleneck this CPU, so don't worry about that. So with our Extreme Edition installed and overclocked, it's time to test some games. Now I've read that this CPU is quite surprising and so 1080p shouldn't be a problem. I will say though that the resolution didn't make much of a difference in terms of performance throughout, and so we thought we might as well stick to full HD. Anyway, Battlefield 1, and we're seeing low to high 20s with 30s here and there in terms of frame rate. Colour me surprised, I wasn't expecting that. Battlefield 1 is one of those games that looks fantastic and I can't really fault the performance all things considered. For reference, we're also using DX11. Witcher 3 next with 1080p resolution once again. We saw around 20 to 30 frames per second depending on the location, but at this point I expect that you would receive a pretty high electricity bill at the end of the month thanks to the insane power consumption. With that aside, another impressive result considering the limitations of this decade-old CPU. Now, Grand Theft Auto 5 is a well-optimised game in my experience, but it's interesting to note that so far this performed the worst, averaging around 20 frames per second and exhibiting a few missing textures. GTA 5 wasn't all that playable. Out in the countryside, it didn't really make a difference and maybe the game touched on 25 every so often, but it was nothing to write home about. Older titles like Fallout 3 ran very well here, 58 frames per second average on medium, with no lag or stutter to speak of, and even venturing into busier areas didn't slow us down. But what about the answer to the question? Why is this thing still selling for upwards of $70? I think, as I mentioned before, it's likely the sort of classic status that some of these CPUs carry. Also, when you compare this to a standard Pentium D, the performance is much better, but the Core 2 Duos of the time would have outperformed this easily. Its extreme days are certainly over, but it is still impressive nonetheless. Even if it does double your electricity bill or set fire to your house, there's no denying that amongst a sea of standard Pentium Ds, this thing certainly would have stood out, and I bet it would have made for some interesting builds and conversations back in its day. So guys, thank you for watching, thank you for taking a look back at the Pentium D Extreme Edition 965 with me today. If you enjoyed the video, click like down below. If you didn't enjoy it so much, click that dislike button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thanks for watching and I'll see you all in the next one.